Energy with naturopath and medical intuitive Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theories that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swing of a pendulum to the waves in the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. In the same way, things such as rocks and minerals vibrate very slowly and at speeds that are imperceptible to us. Living things such as plants, animals, and man vibrate faster and appear to be alive. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is if we take everything in our own universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita as she explores questions such as, what are we made of? Why do we get sick? How can I live a more balanced and whole life? Call in and talk to her and her thought-provoking guest. Send us your questions and get the help you need to move beyond any obstacle or challenges that may be affecting your life, right from the source. So stay tuned and explore your possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. We're going to have a good show. In the first hour, we'll be speaking with Christian Quincey about his new book, Radical Nature, The Nature of Reality, Self, Soul, Mind, and Matter. We're going to get that all straightened out. And in the second hour, we're going to be talking to Marie Jones about her brand new book, The Deja Vu Enigma. Or was that The Deja Vu Enigma? Wait a minute. I think I thought that before. A couple of quick announcements before I bring Christian on, and we'll get started. Don't forget, September 9th through 12th is the 2010 Paranormal Symposium in Angel Fire, New Mexico. I'll be there along with good friends of the show, Stan Friedman, Daryl Sims, John Greenwald, lots of great people. They're also having a Bitsy, My Baby Puppy, tinfoil hat contest. If you don't know who Bitsy is, do go to poodleinatinfoilhat.com and check out her great pic. Also, if you're in the Dallas area, September 14th, Michael Tellinger, who talks about the slave species of God, will be in Dallas. That's September 14th. If you're interested in receiving our newsletter and keeping up to date with who's going to be on the show, do go to the Just Energy Radio webpage and sign up. And you can also send me an email to get a reading, healing, or get some insights into what's going on in your life. And don't forget, later on in the show, we'll be having that mind yoga question of the day. And we did have a winner last week, which we'll announce a little bit later on. So let me tell you a little bit about Christian and get him on the air. Christian Quincey, Ph.D., is Professor of Philosophy and Consciousness Studies at John F. Kennedy University, Dean of Consciousness Studies at the University of Philosophical Research, adjunct faculty with Wisdom University. He is also founder of the Wisdom Academy, offering private mentorship in consciousness. Dr. Quincey is author of the award-winning book, Radical Nature, The Soul of Matter, and Radical Knowing, Understanding Consciousness Through Relationships. His latest books are Consciousness from Zombies to Angels and Deep Spirit, Cracking the Noetic Code. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio from deepspirit.com, Christian Quincey. Hey, Christian, thanks for coming on the show.
Hello, Louise. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So am I. I mean, consciousness, our whole universe is based on consciousness. In science, when we're talking about the nature of reality, where have we come from, kind of a two-parter, where have we come from and where are we now in our understanding of the universe?
Okay, well, I'm glad you like to begin with the little questions.
What is the meaning of life?
Yeah.
Okay, that was a joke.
So yes. Well, we can deal with that along the way, too. So where did we come from and where are we now in our evolution of consciousness? Is that essentially the question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, of course, it depends on which lens we look through. Science will tell us that we came from an event that happened nearly 14 billion years ago that they call the Big Bang. which they claim was the beginning of everything, that then spewed out all the matter and energy that currently populates the vast universe that we know of. And so from that perspective, we all came from the Big Bang. Then there's another perspective, a more philosophical perspective, that would say that the Big Bang was not the beginning of everything. Something had to precede the Big Bang. And the big question is, what was that? Well, religions will tell us it was God, the divine or the creative ultimate, some creative force was responsible for the Big Bang. And philosophy will tell us, at least some philosophies will tell us, that the Big Bang probably did happen about 13.7 billion years ago, but that it was not the beginning of everything. It was one event in an eternal cycle of coming into being and going out of being of universes. So that our universe, even though it's going to last for many, many more billions of years, is not eternal. It did have a beginning, and it will have an end. And when it comes to an end, it will be replaced by some other new universe that will come into being and go through whatever it will go through with its own set of laws and its own creatures who will come to know that universe. So it really depends on the perspective that we look at. I would say that there never was a beginning, that consciousness and energy in some form always existed, and that for some reasons we still don't know exactly how or why, according to science, that this universe began in a major explosion that spewed out immense amounts of energy, and actually most of that energy was consisted of what we call antimatter or even anti-energy. And so 99.9% of what existed in that Big Bang self-annihilated, and the rest, that little 1% that's left over, or 0.01%, whatever the actual number is what now constitutes all the stars and galaxies and the immense universe that we have. So we came from all of that. We could say, even from a scientific perspective, that we came from the stars, that every single one of us, all the elements that make us up, began as parts of stars. So we are stardust, we are star children, as Joni Mitchell used to sing back in the 60s, we are stardust, we are golden. So that's where we came from. Where are we in the evolution of consciousness? Well, we certainly have reached a point in terms of the human species where we are now aware of the history of where we came from, at least different versions of it. And we recognize that over time, not only do species evolve and change, but that consciousness also evolves and changes. And that right now, it's very clear to anyone who's paying attention that one of the results of the consciousness that has been dominant in the world for the past 400 years or so, following the European Enlightenment, is a world that is dominated by consciousness that assumes matter or physical energy is the ultimate nature of reality. And as long as we buy into that vision, then it means we are living in a universe where all meaning and value and purpose becomes inexplicable. And so the shift in consciousness that needs to occur at the moment is a shift that turns that story around and recognizes that the ultimate nature of reality is not just dead stuff, dead matter, dead energy, as modern scientific materialism tells us, but that actually the essence of reality has consciousness within it, and that nature itself, the phrase that I use is that nature itself has a mind of its own, that every single part of nature tingles with the spark of spirit. And when we begin to look at the world and move through the world with that awareness, then our behavior, our interactions with this beautiful planet will also shift. And we won't just treat it as a resource that can satisfy the longings and desires of the human species, but we will recognize that we are one sentient species among countless millions, perhaps even billions, of other species that we share this world with. So we are on the threshold of needing that shift in consciousness. Some of us believe that that shift is taking place. Some of us think it has to take place, but we're not sure that it will take place. And if it doesn't, then the consequences aren't going to be very pretty for what lies ahead. And so that's really one of the big questions of our time is, are we going to make that shift in time so that we won't continue to destroy the planet that has given birth to us, and that we will have a future for ourselves and for other species as well?
Just that little conversation, I already have like a new list of questions for you. But let's go here. Well, you brought up so many good points, the concept of the Big Bang and our universe and the potentiality that they're coming up with they're talking about multiple universes, which I find very interesting because in Hindu traditions they talk about multiple universes. It's like, maybe they knew something we are just figuring out again. But let's go here. You talked about us needing to have this shift in consciousness. Where do you sit as far as the 2012 thing?
Well, I think 2012...
I'm sure you get asked that a lot.
Yes, and it's a very good reminder that that things are heading towards a turning point, one way or another. We can get a little starry-eyed and try to take it too literally, that something dramatic is definitely going to happen in a couple of years' time or in a half's time. I tend to think it's not going to be anything dramatic like that, just like Y2K was never the big event that people thought it would be. I think 2012 is going to come and go in a similar way, that we're not going to have a major global catastrophe happening. The world is not going to come to an end in 2012, and of course, as people who've been paying attention are aware of, that is not what the Mayan calendar or the Mayan cosmology predicts. All that happens there is that their calendars essentially run out in 2012. It doesn't mean that they predict that that's the end of time. So 2012 is a good reminder that we need to take stock of where we are right now in our evolution as a species and our relationship to the planet. And that it's very clear that we cannot continue on living as an industrial society with 6 billion people and rapidly approaching 7 billion people. Right now, the United States has the biggest per capita footprint in terms of the ecological resources that we consume and then put back out as garbage back out into the environment as pollution. But China, of course, is rapidly growing on our heels, and India is not too far behind, and Brazil has aspirations in that direction as well. It is very clear to anyone who pays attention to this that the resources, the finite resources of this planet, simply cannot support a population of anything like 6 billion or even 5 billion or even 3 billion people living at the standard of living that the population of the United States and most people in Europe currently live at. That if the world was ever to be able to bring the Chinese to the level that we have become accustomed to as a lifestyle and here in the U.S., then the planet is essentially doomed. When I say the planet actually is going to continue on surviving. It won't notice anything if the human species vanishes. It will just readjust and carry on as it has before when other species became extinct. But we are rapidly approaching a turning point where we need to change our relationship to the natural world if our species, and unfortunately many, many other species, are not going to become extinct, probably within the next 50 to 150 years if we don't change what we're doing. We cannot continue to consume the resources of this planet at the rate we currently are and expect, realistically, that we will survive as a species. And if we don't, then, as I said, we're not only going to make the planet uninhabitable for our own species, but as we have done, unfortunately, for many other species, we will make it uninhabitable for them as well. A very dramatic example of that, of course, is what's happening to the polar bears right now. Most scientists, most biologists really cannot see that there's going to be much of a future for the polar bears, and that's really unfortunate.
That is sad. But we can see it even in things like seafood. I remember, it wasn't all that long ago that you could buy a piece of fish for a reasonable price, and the prices have just gone, they've gone skyrocket. And, the reason is that there's no fish by any continental landmass. And what's really kind of scary, I mean, I don't know if where you are you have Albertsons. We have Albertsons here, and on the little tag it'll say, like, cod, and then it will have where it's from. And none of it is from the United States. It's all shipped in because we have fished out our water.
Yeah. And more, less and less of the fish that we see showing up on our plates in restaurants or at home is actually from the ocean. It's now grown in fish farms because we have depleted the larger fish species. This is an alarming statistic. The larger fish species in the oceans have been depleted by at least 90% from what they were 100 years ago. That really is alarming. The larger species down about 90%. And of course, it's not just that the price of fish is increasing. Right now, if you talk to nutritionists, they will warn us that it is now dangerous to eat too much fish because of the mercury and lead content in fish. We have polluted the oceans so much that the fat in the fish accumulates these toxins. And so as we eat these fish, not only are we depleting them from the ocean, but we are also introducing human-made toxins that are now in the fish back into human populations. So we have to change that. We literally cannot continue to go on living on this planet as though the human species is special, that this planet is here for us. In my books, and particularly in Radical Nature, that's the main message I make, is that we have to give up. If we're going to make this transition that we were talking about earlier, the first thing we have to do is to give up the story, the belief system that humans are special and that the rest of the planet, including all the other species, are there for our benefit and for us to exploit as we see fit for our own goals and gains and greed and desires. We have to give up that notion. We're not special. Even though modern science and mainstream monotheistic religions like to tell us that we're special, the consequences of believing that have produced the sorry state that we now have to deal with in our environment.
One of the things you said that, if we become extinct as a species, that the Earth wouldn't care. I mean, I do intuitive work, and this was a long time ago. I had gone to Big Sur, and it was right after they had a big fire and, just a really big fire in that area. And, we went and hiked up to the top of this one mountain kind of overlook thing, and I was meditating up there, and the message that I got very clearly from the land was, get out, I want to heal. Mm-hmm. And so people don't even pay attention to the message that the planet gives us. And I don't know that the Earth would necessarily be all that offended if we went away. That sounds really bad, but...
Well, it doesn't sound so bad. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and definitely it would be bad for us. And as I sometimes say to people, some of my best friends are humans, and I would hate to see us vanish. But given the impact of not all humans, but this particular industrially dominated society has inflicted on this planet, other species will certainly begin to thrive if our species did vanish. But that's not the only solution. The solution isn't that the human species has to become extinct. The solution is that the human species, at least the industrialized element of the human species, needs to change its fundamental relationship to the natural world. That's what needs to shift. And if we don't do that, then we don't have a future. It's as simple as that.
In some religious traditions, they make the claim that everything is conscious. You know, a rock is conscious. You know, the earth is conscious. I think it's interesting. You know, they make comments about animals. You know, like, well, they're not conscious. It's like, I'm sorry, but I can look into my dog's eyes, and there's a consciousness there. Do you think that everything, including what we see as inanimate objects, do they all have consciousness?
Well, of course, thank you. That's a really, really good question, and my basic answer to that is yes and no. And let me just explain what I mean by that, without getting too technical. In my view of reality as a philosopher, that's my background. I'm trained in philosophy, and particularly in the branch of philosophy called philosophy of mind, which looks at the relationship between mind and energy, or mind and body, or consciousness in the physical universe. And so in my researches, it is very clear to me that the phrase I use is that consciousness goes all the way down, that there is no level of physical reality where there isn't also some degree of consciousness. So in other words, consciousness is not, as modern science tries to tell us, is not something produced by the brain and exists only in creatures with brains, and usually they mean creatures with a neocortex, and usually they mean just human neocortex. So the idea that consciousness only exists in the brain is a fallacy, it's a myth. It is clear to me that consciousness exists not just in our neurons and brain cells and nervous system, but that it exists in every cell in our body. So consciousness is not just in your head, in fact, it's throughout your entire body. Every cell you have has its own consciousness, has its own ability to feel. But not only that, it goes deeper than that, that every molecule in every cell, and every atom in every molecule, and every subatomic particle in every atom, and every quark or quantum or superstring or whatever it is that lies at the fundamental nature of physical reality also tingles with the spark of consciousness or spirit, that consciousness goes all the way down. So, does that mean that rocks can think, as is often lobbed back at me when I present this position? And I say, no, of course not. That's just to make it a ridiculous challenge, which completely misunderstands the position I'm presenting. No, I don't say that rocks can think. They don't engage in thought processes. They don't try to figure out what's going to happen, you know, what the temperature is going to be next week and how fast and how strong the wind is going to blow to wear them down. No, rocks don't think. And I would say that actually a rock as a rock does not have rock consciousness, but that the molecules that make up the rock do have their own consciousness, just as the molecules that make up human bodies have their own consciousness. So I would say that whereas a rock as a rock does not have its own rock consciousness, a human or a dog or a dolphin or a bee or a bat or a bacterium does have its own consciousness. And the difference between a rock and a human or a dog or any other animal is how the molecules are related to each other. In a rock, the molecules are related in as a heap. They're just kind of compressed together, and there's no necessary or interdependent relationship between the molecules. In a living system, the molecules that make up the living system are interdependent. They all depend on each other, and that creates a unity within the system, and so there's a unity of consciousness. So you and I, even though we're made up of gazillions of cells that have their own little consciousness, we don't experience having gazillions of little consciousnesses. At least most of the time we don't, right? We experience a sense of unity in our consciousness. That's because all the components that make us up are integrated and interrelated in an interdependent fashion. The molecules that make up a rock aren't. They're like grains of sand that you put in a sand bucket and make a sandcastle. They're there, but they're not intrinsically connected to each other in any interdependent way, and so the sandcastle wouldn't have its own sandcastle consciousness. So, you know, as a kid, when you went to the beach, or if you have kids now and you take them to the beach and they build their beautiful sandcastles and the tide comes in and washes them down, you know, we might have a kind of anthropomorphic projection that feels sad that the little citadel we created has now washed away, and how bad that is for the sandcastle. But actually, the sandcastle's not feeling anything. That's just in our consciousness. But what I am saying is that the molecules that make up the grains of the sand do have their own degree of consciousness. And that's the point of view that many modern scientists and philosophers find very difficult to accept, the idea that something as tiny as a molecule could have its own consciousness. But the reason I'm convinced that's the case is because we are made up of those things. We are made up of those molecules. We are made up of those cells, and we have consciousness. And therefore, the only way to explain the fact that we are made up of these material molecules and we have consciousness is that those material molecules can't be just made of pure matter. They must also have their own consciousness as well, and that's why we have consciousness. So that's a long way of answering your question to say that consciousness does go all the way down, and that nature tingles with the spark of spirit and consciousness throughout. But it doesn't mean that every form that we come across in nature has its own consciousness. So I wouldn't say a river has consciousness or a cloud has consciousness. They would be made up of these independent, not interdependent, independent molecules. But any system that has its components related to each other in an interdependent fashion will have its own unity consciousness.
And it could be, and I'm just throwing it out there, that it has a kind of consciousness that it is so foreign to us that we just can't relate to it at all.
Well, that's almost certainly the case. There's a famous essay written by a philosopher back in the early 1960s from the UK, from Britain. His name is Thomas Nagel, and he wrote a paper that startled the philosophical community, and the title of the paper is, "What is it like to be a bat?" And what he meant by that...
Like a baseball bat?
No, like a bat, the mammal that flies in caves.
Okay,
yeah,
just checking.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, that's what he meant. So what is it like to be the bat that's a mammal, the one that flies around? And basically what he was proposing, or what he was pointing out, is that we don't really have a clue what it is like to be a bat flying around, because the world that we know it through our senses of sight predominantly, and to some extent hearing and touch. But for the bat, the world shows up for the bat through the sense of sonar, which is not a sense that we... So as a bat flies around the world, it's flying around the world through echolocation. And we really don't, we might try to imagine what that would be like, but we really don't know what it's like to move through the world with sonar as our dominant sense. So we don't know what it is like to be a bat. But the point he made is that even though we don't know what it is like to be a bat flying around in the dark, we don't know what it feels like for that bat, we can be pretty confident that it feels like something to be that bat. That even though we don't know what it feels like, for the bat itself, it does feel like something as it flits around looking for a mate or looking for food or to avoid obstacles. So the same kind of argument applies to a cell or a molecule. We can't hardly imagine what it would be like to be a single cell or to be a molecule. But we can think about it in such a way that we can be pretty sure, be pretty confident that it must feel like something to be a single cell or to be a molecule or an atom or an electron or a proton, even though we don't know what that would feel like. Now, it is possible that in some alternative state of consciousness, as shamans often get into, that we could access what it is like to be a single cell, or what it is like to be a bat, or what it is like to be a jaguar, or what it is like to be a fish. But that requires getting out of our... Yes.
There's the music, which means we need to take a break, but let's come back and talk more about consciousness and what that means for us. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're talking to Christian de Quincey about his new book, Radical Nature, The Soul of Matter, and we'll be back with Christian and answering the mind yoga question after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.
sensitive to energy? Want to explore the world beyond the five senses? Looking for a new career as an alternative healthcare practitioner? Then the Institute of Applied Energetics, Medical Intuition, and Energy Medicine training programs may be right for you. Our comprehensive curriculum provides students with a deep understanding of how to detect, evaluate, and transform the subtle body, as well as techniques for correcting energetic imbalances that may underscore a person's ability to experience radiant health. So if you are sensitive to energy, contact the Institute of Applied Energetics right away. Be a catalyst for changing the way healthcare is done around the world. Visit www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com and start your new career today. How would you like to live long and enjoy great health? How about creating solid bones and whiter teeth? Strengthen your heart and eyes and have radiant, youthful-looking skin. There is an ancient health and longevity secret that has been used for millennia in Egypt, India, and China that can help you achieve this. For the first time in the modern world, Pearlsium brings this ancient wellness secret to you. For more information about Pearlsium, visit www.productsforthesoul.com. Before we get back to the show, I would like to thank all of you for tuning into Just Energy Radio. Many of the people I've helped over the years were listeners just like you. If you're at a junction in your life, don't stand alone at this important time. Call me or send me an email. We can set up a private consultation so that you too can experience health, healing, and wholeness in your life. To find out more about the services I offer, visit www.soulhealer.com.
And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and I'll bring Christian Quincey back on, and we can talk more about his book, Radical Nature, in a second. But let's talk about the mind yoga question from last week. So here's the question, and this was last week's, and we do have a winner. This Sanskrit word meaning sky, space, or ether is a term used in theosophy to describe a compendium of mystical knowledge encoded in a non-physical plane of existence. Now, it's even hard to read that question, but the answer is the Akashic Record. And the winner is Eileen McKinley, and she won a copy of Dr. Shaw's Soul Communication book, which she will be getting here in the mail. So a little later on in the show, we'll be doing this week's Mind Yoga question, and the winner will be getting a copy of Cosmic Connection, Messages for a Better World by Carol Lynn. But we'll talk more about that later in the second hour of the show. So let me get Christian back on, and we'll keep going. Christian, before we went to break, we were talking about consciousness. Let me ask you this. Because we're talking about consciousness, but we haven't really defined what consciousness is. I mean, is it a kind of energy? I mean, obviously it's not a physical thing, but what is it? Does anybody know?
The $64
and then tell us the meaning
question.
of life.
Yes, okay. Well, actually, those two questions, of course, are intimately related. Yes, I would say that consciousness is not a form of energy. Now, I know that that's almost heretical in some communities, but I have good reasons for saying that, which is not to diminish either consciousness or energy, but I am making a distinction between them. I think it's an important distinction if we want to truly understand the nature of consciousness and, indeed, the nature of energy. So what is consciousness? Well, actually, I've been teaching courses on consciousness at universities now for a couple of decades, and as you might imagine, I frequently am asked that question. I'm asked it on radio shows and TV shows, and every time I'm asked that question, I say, you know what, I'm not going to define consciousness, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is that the word definition means to delimit something. And it's way premature for us to decide what the limitations are, or if indeed consciousness does have any limitations. So that's one reason. But the other is that a definition is something that exists objectively. You go to a dictionary or you go online to find out what the objective meaning of this word is. And of course, we then have to ask ourselves, well, who decides what the correct meaning is of something that is essentially not objective? The essence of consciousness is that it is subjective. It is not objective. And so for those two reasons, I avoid giving a definition of consciousness. But what I do emphasize is that it's really important for us to clarify what we mean when we use the term consciousness. So I'm making a distinction between clarifying what it means and offering a definition. So what consciousness means to me, and it may mean something different to you and to many of your listeners, but what it means to me is consciousness is the ability to know, to feel, and to purposefully direct energy. So it's the ability to feel, it's the ability to know or be aware of something, and it's the ability to make choices. Anything that is aware or knows or can feel or can make choices, by definition, is conscious.
I'm going to throw one out here
yes,
at you. You know, most scientists, or the scientific community, always wants to have some kind of physical proof. But when you're talking about something like consciousness, it's devoid of physical proof because it's 100% subjective. How do they deal with that?
Well, yes, of course, and basically the question you've raised there, I've written a trilogy of books, or at least I'm working on a trilogy. The first is the one you mentioned, Radical Nature. The second one in the trilogy is called Radical Knowing. And the third one, which I'm working on, is called Radical Science. And basically the theme, the question explored in that third book is, can we have a science of consciousness? For the very reason you've just raised, is that if consciousness is subjective and everything that science explores and studies is objective, then how can the scientific method ever produce anything, any knowledge about consciousness? All that science can do is study the brain. But studying the brain, and even though that's valuable and important work, is not the same as studying consciousness. So I would say that the answer to the question, just to give a foretaste, is that yes, we can have a science of consciousness provided science undergoes a radical transformation and gives up the notion that the ultimate nature of reality is just pure physical objective stuff. It has to recognize that there is an intrinsic subjective component to reality. In other words, that mind is everywhere present throughout the cosmos, everywhere present throughout nature, and that we need to then have a different set of tools for exploring consciousness. We cannot explore consciousness with our senses. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't taste it, and so on. But the only way to explore consciousness is through consciousness itself, as the great spiritual traditions have known for millennia. So yes, we can have a science of consciousness. I would say that the yogic tradition, that yoga is a science of consciousness. Many of the great spiritual traditions, I would say Zen Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, are forms of sciences of consciousness, for example. So where we use consciousness itself to explore consciousness, we can have a science of consciousness. But it's not delivering objective data. It's not delivering proof. And by the way, just as a side note, the whole idea of proof within science is something that's unattainable. No scientist has ever proved anything. Most people don't recognize that or realize that. Science is not in the business of proving anything. The best that science can do is to disprove a hypothesis, but it can never conclusively prove that any hypothesis is true. And we don't need to go into that, but we can go back to that later if you like. So consciousness
Can you give me an example, though? Just a very quick example of what that means.
Oh, yes, I can. An example would be, a scientist might say, I'm going to present the theory or the hypothesis that all swans are white. Okay, so then how do you scientifically test that? How can you prove that? Well, you make observations. You go out and you count the number of swans that you see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They're all white. Great. So then you do another set of observations, 50, 100, 1,000. a million observations, and every swan that you've seen is white. So you think you might have proven your hypothesis that all swans are white. However, you then go to Australia and you come across a creature that is a swan, but it's black. So now what do you do with your hypothesis? Even though you had 1 million or even 10 million or 1 billion observations and every one of them confirmed your hypothesis, it never proved it, because it's always possible that the very next observation will not be a white swan. It'll be a swan of some different color, as indeed turns out to be the case. When when Europeans first discovered Australia, it had already been inhabited, of course, they discovered that there were black swans on the Australian subcontinent.
Well, I know how you prove it. You cover up the fact that there's a black swan, and then you tell anybody that says they saw one that they're crazy. Isn't that how they
yeah, yeah, that's true. Science can be very slippery like that, and sometimes it is. They might say, well, then by definition, it's not a swan because it's black. So, but that's cheating.
Well, I know.
The fact is that science can never come up with any number of confirming observations that conclusively says the very next observation is always going to be the same. It just isn't in that business. The best it can come up with are statistical probabilities and predictions, but it can never actually prove anything. But we're getting off on a sidetrack. I just wanted to say that science can never prove anything, even about the physical world, and it certainly cannot prove anything about consciousness. It's just not in the business of saying anything about consciousness. Right now, science relies on measurement and objective observations, and consciousness is not something that exists objectively. It's not something that can be observed. It's not something that can be measured. The best that science can do currently is to observe and measure what goes on in the brain and the nervous system, and that can give us a clue in terms of how that might correlate with states of consciousness. But it's never actually telling us or revealing anything about the nature of consciousness itself. And of course, the major challenge here is the issue of choice and free will, that science relies on having laws, but as soon as we factor in choice, then laws go out the window. You cannot have laws that exist in a universe where choices can be made. A law, by definition, a scientific law, is something that exists universally, everywhere and for all time. If that were the case, then nothing could ever make a choice. So we do know from our own experience that we make choices. So that means there is no such thing as a law of nature or a law of science. What it does mean is that there are habits of nature, or habits of science. And some of these habits can be very, very deeply ingrained, like the habit of gravity. But it's not a law in the sense of something that is eternal and universal.
That brings me to an interesting point. One of the things you talk about in the book is about the role of the observer. I mean, quantum physics makes me crazy. There's a half-dead cat, there's one or two. It changes every minute. And there's the whole idea that an observer is required in order to have reality. But why doesn't our reality constantly change? I mean, if I'm observing something, why can't my reality be that I can walk through a wall or do something else? Why do the walls seem solid to me if I'm in control of the reality that I'm observing?
Yeah. Well, the fact is you're not. You're not in control of your reality you're observing. One of the cliches that I challenge in one of my other books, Consciousness from Zombies to Angels, is the idea that we create our own reality. And that's a very naive statement to make. The more accurate statement is to say that we participate in co-creating reality. But none of us creates our own reality. There's no such thing as my reality and your reality. You and I both share a reality, and then we have to deal with that. But the reality that we share is something that we contribute to co-creating through the choices that we make. But we are never at liberty to purely and independently create our own reality as though we're living in a universe where other sentient beings that make choices don't also exist. The fact is we share a universe, we share a reality with other beings, not just human beings, with other animals, in fact, single cells, and as I say, molecules and even subatomic particles, all making choices. And in fact, even at the quantum level. And I think what is so exciting about quantum physics, and it's kind of surprising, isn't it, to realize that quantum physics, which feels like such a new revolutionary science, has been around now for more than 100 years. It's actually been around that long. But it's still new because it's so unfamiliar to our common sense notion of how reality is put together. But for the first time in the history of science, in its 400 years, what science has now discovered is that it can no longer ignore consciousness, that the consciousness of the observer is not just having an incidental impact on what happens in the quantum experiment. It's a necessary element in the quantum experiment. Without an observer to observe the field of quantum potentials, those potentials would never collapse into an actuality. They would just remain in the domain of quantum potentials. But the world is not made up of potentials. The world is made up of actualities that then create new possibilities and new potentials. So we have to deal with an actual world. The actual world is the world that has already been created, co-created by all the sentient beings that have existed from time immemorial, and we have to deal with that. We can't just ignore it and decide to walk out on the freeway and say, well, I'm not going to believe in trucks and cars anymore. You know, you're not going to live very long if you decide to do that. So we have to acknowledge that the actual world, the objective world, does exist, and we don't have very much control over that. What we have control over is how we then interact with that world, how we make choices about our own lives. And that's very, very different from declaring, oh, I create my own reality. I think you're going to be in for some very sad and painful rude awakenings if people try to live in the world as though they create our own reality. No, the more accurate way to understand that is that through our choices, we participate in co-creating a shared reality.
And this is, you know, the word I want to use is like a group agreement that we as beings on this planet have all agreed that, you know, something that's solid is solid kind of thing. See, this is where I start getting lost personally.
Yeah. Well, it's not just that humans agree. See, again, if you remember the position that I was presenting in the first half of our conversation, is that consciousness goes all the way down. So quanta, photons, electrons, protons, they are all making choices. They have a set of agreements that we have very little say in. There are a lot more of them than there are of us. And so we have to deal with what you might call it is the democracy of the cosmos. That all these gazillions of sentient beings at every level of reality are making choices. And from those, they kind of vote on how reality is going to be. They co-create it. And then humans come along billions of years later, and we like to think that we're going to now take control of things. Oops, sorry, that's not the way it's going to turn out. We have to deal with the reality that all the other sentient beings are creating. Now, we contribute to that. It doesn't mean that we have no choice, that we're fully determined and fated, as standard science tries to tell us, because it basically says all there are is the determinism of the force and laws of nature, and we really have no choice in the matter. That's the other extreme. So between the two extremes of saying we have no choice, that is all determined, which is what standard materialism tries to tell us, and then the other extreme of what we might call spiritual New Age, which says, no, we create our own reality, I'm saying that the actual reality is somewhere in between those two, that there is a lot of determinism going on. All we have to do is pay attention to our own... We don't have to get too abstract about this. We just pay attention to our own lives. Just notice how much of your life, and by you I mean me and everyone listening to this show, how much of our lives is determined by what happened to us in childhood. How often have you found yourself in a relationship where your 2 or 3-year-old boy or girl has now entered the conversation and starts to mess things up because we are so determined by what has happened in our past? So there's no doubt about that we carry our past around with us. And of course, not just our own past, we carry around with us the past of the entire universe. But let's focus for a moment on our own past. We carry the past of our own lives from our moment of birth, and perhaps even before that, well, not perhaps, definitely even before our moment of birth, right up to this present moment. Definitely there is a pressure of the past that we have to deal with in the present moment. But that's not the whole story. In addition to the past that carries us along like a leaf in a stream, we can also make choices in the present moment. So we are not wholly determined, but we do have to deal with the determinism and the pressure of the past. And we deal with that by making choices that take into account the reality of our situation. So we have to accept what is so. This is a common teaching, as far as I can see, in all the great spiritual traditions. It begins with accepting what is. So we have to accept what is, and then we then can exercise choice. But until the moment we actually accept the way things are, the choices that we make are going to be at odds with reality. And of course, that's why we learn in all the great traditions about surrender. Yeah, go ahead.
And I just want to give you a heads up. We have about 5 or 6 minutes, just to let you know. What about like the law of attraction? You know, because that really talks about I can create my reality, or at least a piece of my reality, from a quantum physics, philosophical, you know, from your world, you know, which I'm getting is, you know, more scientific, you know, mystical but scientific. Any credence? What do you think about that whole concept?
Well, yeah, I think like most of these gems of phrases that the law of attraction expresses a truth, even a deep truth, but it can also be oversimplified and can be misleading if it's taken at face value. Yes, there definitely is an attractive force that happens in the universe. But you know what? We also have the phrase opposites attract, yes?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just like attracts like, which is what the law of attraction tells us. Opposites also attract. And that applies to genders. Of course, it's not only, we also know that homosexuality exists and like attracts like. But in many cases, opposites attract. And we know that not just in human interactions, but also in physics. You have the positive and negative pole in magnetism and in electricity, in electromagnetism. So opposites also attract. So we need to be careful to realize that it's not just that like attracts like, and to then get blinded by that. We have to deal with the opposites as well. That reality consists, the psychological reality that we all live in, has a shadow and a light, and we have to deal with the balancing of the light and the dark. If we don't own up to our own shadow, then we're very unlikely ever to experience our own magnificence and our own light. The subtitle of my book, Consciousness from Zombies to Angels, is the shadow and the light of knowing who you are. That to know who we truly are, we have to integrate our inner zombies as well as our inner angels, our inner shadow and our inner light. And so there are opposites that we need to deal with. It's not just everything is on the positive side of the spectrum of reality. We have to deal with the opposites as well.
Looking at the time, I'm going to say one last question because I don't know how long this will take. In your opinion, can or will science and spirit ever meet? And I'm using spirit in a very generic kind of sense, but I know know you know where I'm going.
Yes, absolutely, and I think so. I think they have been meeting all along, except that the dominant voices in the scientific establishment has refused to recognize that. I mean, just take the works of Albert Einstein, for example. If you ever wanted to see a scientist who was in touch with spiritual reality, just pay attention to the work that he was doing in the world. I consider my own work to be an effort, an attempt, a program to integrate what I call the 4 gifts of knowing: the scientist's gift of the senses, the philosopher's gift of reason and language, the shaman's gift of feeling and participatory knowing and alternative states of consciousness, and then the mystic's gift of intuition accessed in sacred silence. And so silence is actually a way of knowing, deep knowing, that unfortunately is a very rare commodity in modern civilization. We need far more silence in our lives to know who we are and how we relate to the world around us.
I agree with that. I mean, we're always so busy running around and not being, in the moment, as they say, that it's really hard for us to know our essence because there's just so much, I'm going to say, going on in our heads.
Yep, that's true. Yep. Yeah, we need to just take a moment out, take a deep breath, and settle into feeling our bodies, and to practice what I call to learn to feel our thinking, not just think our thoughts, but just rattle on automatic. When we begin to become embodied and actually feel what's going on in our bodies, then we begin to become aware of the relationship between the thoughts that are going on and the feelings. Every thought that anybody ever had began as a feeling in their body. We need to relearn the capacity, the technique, the awareness of paying attention to what's going on in our bodies much more than we do. That's not something that's taught in schools and colleges, unfortunately. So we need to pay attention to the feelings in our bodies and learn to feel our thinking. And when we do that, one of the things that we begin to notice is the difference between what I call learning to speak from silence rather than speaking to fill the silence, which is what most of us do. And of course, I'm a major culprit in that, in this conversation. I realize that I've been talking at 50 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour throughout our conversation. But this is a radio program. For us to sit in silence for the entire hour probably wouldn't be very attractive to your listeners.
No, they would probably be in the chat room going, "We can't hear you. We can't hear you," which has happened. Trust me.
It might be an experiment worth doing sometime. If you want to get me back on, and we can spend half the show sitting in silence and just watch what happens to your listeners. I'm only
but don't tell them.
About that, by the way. Yeah.
Christian, Radical Nature, is this your newest book?
Well, yes, it is. It's also my first book. It's actually a new edition of my first book that was reissued this year. So effectively, I have 3 books out at the moment. I have the new edition of Radical Nature, which is the one we've been talking about mostly in the show today. And then I have Consciousness from Zombies to Angels, The Shadow and the Light of Knowing Who You Are. And then a novel called Deep Spirit, Cracking the Noetic Code, which is a novel about the evolution of consciousness and how we need to make that shift in consciousness if we're going to make it through the next couple of generations and beyond.
Well, Christian, the music's going to come up. Let me put out your website. It's www.deepspirit.com.
Yes, it is, and it's also www.thewisdomacademy.org. And probably in a week or 2 from now, I will have a new website that will be christiandequincey.com.
Cool.
And then I have a blog, which is thewisdomblog.wordpress.com, where a lot of these ideas are also discussed.
So people can get some more information. Can they get to the blog from your website, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes, they can. Yeah, they can.
Cool. They can keep up on consciousness. See, there's the music, which means we need to go. Christian, thank you. You've been a wonderful guest, and definitely have to have you back on, but for 2 hours, because this was way too short.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been delightful. I've really enjoyed our time together, and look forward to another conversation.
All right. Thanks, Christian. That was Christian DeQuincy, author of Radical Nature. We'll be back with Marie Jones after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.
Balance in all things is critical to maintaining health. In the hectic drive of today's world, many of us forget to take care of our most important asset, ourselves. At ProductsForTheSoul.com, we want to support your effort to nurture yourself. We offer a wide variety of herbs, supplements, and high-quality, ready-to-eat, all-natural foods. We even offer holographic chip technology products that can augment the body's natural ability to increase energy, improve sleep, and mitigate pain. Best of all of our products are delivered straight to your door. It's time to start loving yourself. Visit ProductsForTheSoul.com and let us help you along the way. Take a journey to the dark side of the spirit world and meet the bad kids on the block in Dark Angels, an insider's guide to ghosts, spirits, and attached entities. Who are these bad kids? As a child, you might have met one at night, under your bed, in your closet, or down a dark hallway. Dark Angels is an adult dissertation about ghosts. It's filled with revealing information about how these dark forces can influence our lives. Order your copy of Dark Angels today. Visit www.darkangelsbook.com for more information.
Move past the crossroads in your life and discover alternative solutions to your deepest concerns at soulhealer.com. So whether it's a physical problem, an emotional issue, a question about work, or troubles in your relationship, naturopath and medical intuitive Dr. Rita Louise can help you. Bring peace, harmony, and health back into your life. Schedule a session today. Visit soulhealer.com right away and live the life you've been dreaming of.